You guys can't hear what I'm listening to, can you?
Nope.
No, but I really love videos about planes taking off, so send it to me later.
Letting folks in a second if you want to go off camera, Michael. All right, last chance to stop this train.
Toot toot, let's go.
An architect is designing a new community center in an arid climate that is predominantly exposed to southern winds. So the air is coming in, the winds are coming in from the south. The client has the following requirements. The community center will be made up of 3 rectangular buildings arranged in a U-shaped configuration. A meditation garden will be located in the center of the U-shape and must be usable for as much of the year as possible. Building location and orientation on the site should maximize passive design strategies, including cooling. So the question is, which direction should the open end of the shape face? And the choices are north, south, east, and west. And NCARB's answer for this is from the NCARB practice exam. And NCARB's answer for this is that it should be south. NCARB's answer is absolutely 100% wrong. It's a horrible question. I have let them know that. I get asked all the time about this question from people saying, is this right? And I'm like, no, it's not right. It's not right for 2 reasons, both of which are counterintuitive. It seems like it should be right, right? If the wind is coming from the south, you want to open it to the south. But in reality, it's a bad question. There won't be meaningful wind there, and wind doesn't actually cool you in an arid climate. More on both of those in a minute. So and I've asked them to remove it. Maybe for those of you guys who are eventually watching this on within the Amber Book course, maybe by then they have removed it, but I've asked them probably almost a year ago, at least 6 months ago, and I don't think it's gone yet. They have told me that they understand it's a bad question, but they haven't removed it or replaced it. So the correct answer, technically, according to NCARB, is south, but it's a horrible question. It's just not true. And so that's today's discussion, is just kind of counterintuitive things, things that really we don't have a sense that they should be right. We kind of maybe learned in school that they should be right. We certainly learned in the Amber Book that they should be right. But I think it's worth taking a moment to kind of recognize that it doesn't feel like these things are right. In the same way, it doesn't feel like however many thousands of pounds or tons or whatever of metal shouldn't be able to fly. But the part that the airfoil, the cross section of the wing, is what allows it to fly, and it allows it to fly in very much the same reason that the U-shaped corridor, the U-shaped courtyard is usually not going to provide airflow, and that is because well, it's a pressure issue. So in this case, the air going over the wing kind of spreads out, and the air going under the wing, especially when the wing first takes off, they kind of often go like this. So in cross section, so as it takes off, there's lift and there's drag, and there's a high pressure underneath that pushes up. There's a low pressure on top that sucks it up. So it's both. It's both a high pressure underneath and a low pressure up top, and it seems counterintuitive. And when you're putting it's kind of how if you do it in a car, when you put your hand out, and I wonder if kids these days ever put their hands out, because I have noticed that even on nice days, people will keep the windows up. It's always a little depressing to me, but Americans are the only people who idle when they're waiting for someone. So next time you're waiting for someone, like at the airport, just turn off your car. It's a significant waste of energy. But you always see Americans kind of idling, even with the windows up, even on a nice day. Anyhow, I digress from my annoying, patronizing, idle shaming. And I'll say that you put your hand out the window, and you understand if you kind of tilt your hand just right, it will push it up. And it's the same principle. There's a high pressure on the forward side of your hand, which is the wing, and there's a low pressure on the back side that we don't think about as much. So it's kind of intuitive that the wind would push it back. It's less intuitive that the low pressure would be sucking it back at the same time, because both are happening at the same time in that airfoil. So with some of that in mind, go ahead and, because it's a blitz, we're going to go rapid fire. Go ahead and identify in each circle which one is going to be positively pressurized and which one is going to be negatively pressurized. We will get back together in 2 minutes. All right. Well, generally on the windward side, which is the windy side of a wall, it's going to be positive. So this will be positive and positive and positive and positive. And this will be, and on the leeward side, the back side, these will be negative typically. And so those are pretty easy. The two inside, this one will be positive and this one will be positive. So the two inside are actually a little bit more confusing. According to NCARB, this will be positive because there's air coming through. And this will be negative because it's kind of not on the open window, assuming all these windows are open. Now, in reality, it's a little more sophisticated than that, as you might imagine. Fluid dynamics doesn't quite work like in this kind of binary way, but generally this holds. And so what you need for breezes is you need positive openings like we have here and here, for instance, and you need negative openings like we have here and here and here, for instance. Is actually my house. And the interesting thing is you need both. So if I open up these two, this one here, let me change colors. Let's change colors to blue. So if I open up this one and I open up this one, I won't get much of a breeze. And if I open up this one and this one and this one, I won't get much of a breeze. And if I continue to open up windows, I won't get much of a breeze. It seems counterintuitive, but I won't get much of a breeze because there's nowhere for the air to go. If the other windows on the negative side are closed, there's nowhere for the air to go. And so what we need is we need that second opening. We need that second opening. Just anyone who's ever beer bonged, or is it beer? But it's not really beer bonged. It's well, anyone who's ever stuck their finger over the thumb over a straw and lifted up understands this principle, as with anyone who's ever tried to shotgun a beer, where you need that second opening in the top of the beer to allow it to come out the bottom, and with any kind of rapidity. And so what we need to do is, if I have all those open, as I open more and more and more, we still don't get any breeze, but then I open this guy and then the breeze starts flowing through because the air needs a place to go. And now it has a place to go. And then as we continue to open more of these on the other side, then we'll start to enjoy a breeze. In fact, as you might imagine, kind of if we have X number of square feet of opening, it works most efficiently if there's comparable sizes. So 1/2 of X is the area on the windward side, and 1/2 of X in terms of total area of opening is on the leeward side. But of course, it's not usually possible to get it that close. And it's okay if there's a 2-to-1 ratio. When you start to get to a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 ratio, opening more on the windward side really doesn't help you, or whichever side has more. So if it's if this one is, if on this side is 5 square feet, and let's do it differently. If on this side is 30 square feet and on this side is 10 square feet, it still will, it still will work, but opening a bunch of new windows on this side really won't increase our wind flow anymore. And so, and I understand that some of you guys have said that NCARB has the answer as facing north. That's still wrong. North is wrong also, because U-shaped buildings, as a general rule, only have, if they're facing north or south, whichever, if they're facing south, it's a positive on the south end, but there's no negative. There's no place for the air to go. And likewise, if it's facing north, so if they did in fact fix it, maybe it never was south, but if they did in fact fix it, and quote unquote fix it by saying the correct answer is north by having a negative, that doesn't work either. You need a positive and a negative. So if you had kind of a breezeway style situation, then facing that obviously north-south would promote wind flow through. Now you're saying, but I know of some U-shaped alleyways that have wicked winds. And it is true, it is possible, but it's more three-dimensional than that. Like, in other words, there's something else going on. There's a high, if this one's really high and this one's really high and this one's fairly low, then you can have relative to the others that are high, you can have a situation where there's positive and negative because it's flowing over. So if you ever been in a courtyard where it's been windy because it's open to the wind or it's opened away from the wind, it is true that especially out of the wind shadow. So in this area here, you might have wind again if this is tall and if this is tall, but that's not really what it says, and that's not really what they're thinking. So so maybe a building on Pilotes, yeah. Like we're all leave it up to an architect to be like, Corbu has it figured out. So this is, if you were to see in the exam some kind of a question that's asking you to locate the high pressure and the low pressure, that's generally what you want to do. You want to find the easy ones, which are on the windward side, which are high pressure, and the easy ones, which are on the leeward side, which are low pressure. And then just inside anything that's windward, you could probably assume it's high. Just inside, if it's kind of being blocked, you can kind of assume it's low. But again, in reality, it's way more complex than that. Just know that. Now, the second reason that this doesn't make any sense, that this question doesn't make any sense, is the second reason. Okay, so going back to the first thing, intuitively, you would think that just opening more windows or orienting your building to, or in this case, away from the breezes might be helpful, and maybe someone read something out of context, but that's not really how it works. Likewise, someone thought, oh, it's a hot, arid climate, so it's hot, so we need breezes. And that's not really how it works either. So breezes don't really cool us in hot, arid climate because, and this is also counterintuitive, but you just kind of, if you're taking the AREs, and then just if you're kind of trying to understand how the heat of vaporization works, you just need to buy into the idea that when something evaporates, it makes everything around it cool. Now, a lot of people like to say, well, it removes heat, but I don't think we have to think like that. I don't know why middle school and high school teachers tell us we have to think like that. It makes the math easier, but it doesn't make the concept any easier. In fact, it makes it much less intuitive. But if you make something evaporate, you make everything around it cool. Now, if you have a humid environment, a hot, humid environment, the humidity is actually a form of heat, which is also counterintuitive. It's like, well, we think of heat as being the temperature, but temperature is one form of heat, that's sensible heat. But there's latent heat, which is the humidity, and latent heat is very much heat. It causes us discomfort, and when there's humidity, what happens is the air is full of water molecules, vapor molecules, and the air is kind of like a sponge that's full. And so there won't be much sweating, almost no sweating when you get to really humid situations. There'll be lots of sweating. There won't be any sweat evaporating. And the sweat evaporating is how we cool ourselves, which you surely know. But again, it's kind of a counterintuitive idea. Like, we sweat and we understand that kind of being wet makes us cold. But the reason that, for instance, if you come out of an ocean and there's really strong breezes, they're going to be much more cold than if you come out of an ocean in the same air temperature and there's not strong breezes, because the evaporation is actually speeding it up. In fact, I find that parents often will put a swim, like if the water's cold or the air's cold or both, they'll put like a swim shirt on their kid to theoretically keep them warmer, but I think it just makes them colder, because when they come out, their skin is wet all the time and they're just evaporating more. So and I've noticed this all the time, if you see kids shivering, there's a really high likelihood that they have a wet shirt on. And the kid who didn't have any shirt on is not shivering, they're fine, because it all evaporated kind of within a few minutes and they're fine in the sun. But anyhow, if you have a really humid climate, then the air is very moist, it's very wet, it's humid, it's latent humidity, latent heat. And the air is like a sponge, and the air is like a sponge, and the sponge is full of water, so there's not going to be much evaporation going on. Conversely, if you're in an arid environment, the air does not have much water vapor in it, and the air will happily evaporate your sweat. So if you have someone that's sweaty, they're likely in a humid environment, but the irony is the sweat is doing less. So you will sweat more in an arid environment than a humid environment. Let me say that again. You'll sweat more in Arizona than you will in Washington, D.C. or Atlanta. But the sweat will just evaporate in the hot, arid climate, and that's why 90 degrees in Southern California or San Diego doesn't feel like 90 degrees in Jacksonville, because you're allowed to sweat. Now, if we want to promote evaporation, we can do it by promoting breezes. So in a hot, humid climate, in a hot, humid climate, we can promote evaporation by moving air. So ceiling fans are, common in Savannah or Charleston and humid climates, because they allow for the air to move, and that will cool you off. But opening a window in Arizona will generally just bring 110-degree air in. Many of you guys know that in the month of July, Phoenix exceeded 110 degrees each of the days except for one this year. So opening a window in Phoenix, and burn units are seeing people who pass out from the heat in the 110-degree weather and land on 180-degree asphalt, and then they're getting burned, which is nuts, right? So in that situation, adding a breeze to it is kind of like, I don't know, a hairdryer, I guess. It's not that you can't cool at all. It's just that you're not going to cool much because you already are kind of at maximum evaporation because the air is dry. All right. Now, for our, so you wouldn't want to promote a breeze to cool you off in your meditation garden in a hot, arid climate anyway. So that's the second part that's wrong with that. But go ahead and this is our next question in this counterintuitive blitz. It has to, you can, if you went on the demonstration exam or the real exam, you can click on the plumbing tab and you see these formulas. And the one we're most interested in is that 1 PSI is equal to 2.31 feet of water. And the question is, in our building, we want to have 50 PSI coming into the building. We're just going to say it's on the, on ground level. And the question is, how high does the water in the water tower have to be to get us to 50 PSI, given that formula? So don't put the answer in the chat. You can, if you really feel the need, you can certainly DM me directly, but don't put it for everyone to see. But see if you can figure out the answer to this. You have 2 minutes. All right. Come to a good stopping point. All right, so this is actually fairly intuitive, kind of. If you hold water higher, the water is going to want to push itself down because water wants to seek its own level. So if you imagine, I don't know, let's keep with the beer bong kind of theme. If you have a beer bong, you need to hold the funnel higher than the person so that there's pressure pushing the water down. If the person was higher than the funnel, the water wouldn't ever go up. There would be no pressure, pushing it up. So the question is, how high does it need to be? Well, if we see that 1 PSI, and by the way, these days NCARB has promised that they may still have the references, but they're going to include this kind of formula within the question. So you won't have to click around for the references typically. That's what they're promising anyway. But if 1 PSI is equal to 2.31 feet of water, which it sounds a little bit kind of counterintuitive anyway, like what? But just go with it. And we want 50 PSI. We're going to have to multiply both sides by 50 is equal to 2.31 feet per PSI times 50 PSI. And that's going to get us 115.5 feet. Now, one of the reasons I found that people get kind of turned off or intimidated by these kind of math questions is when they get to an answer, when they see me get to an answer, they kind of look, okay, 115.5, but you actually have to kind of picture that. What does that mean? Well, that's like 115 feet. That's something like 10 stories in the air. And that feels kind of right for a water tower. And so what we do, the way we provide pressure for our buildings is we store water up high. That's under pressure. It's going to come down through, or actually, I think it actually may come up through there, but I'm not sure. But we're going to pump it up to there, and then it's going to come down. And you can just kind of see by looking at it, I guess, a little bit intuitively, you can understand how there'd be water under pressure. I mean, water pressure itself is a little bit of a weird concept, just like air pressure is with the airfoil, or the house with the windy side and the leeward side. But you can kind of understand that water would be, the weight of the water above would be pushing down, and could, then go underground. And we could have a situation where we have our building down here and we have our water tower up here, and we're going to just allow it to feed down with gravity, because we're going to pump it up. So we'll pump it up from the reservoir. There's a reservoir over here. We're going to pump it up, and then we're going to bring it down, and it's going to be down, and we want it at 50 psi. And we can kind of understand intuitively that if this distance is higher, there's going to be more psi, and if that distance is lower, there'll be less psi. What's a little less intuitive, I think, for people, is if we go the other way. So we say, okay, water seeks its own level. Let's go the other way. So go ahead and take a look at this. So water in this case is coming into the building at 75 psi, and it's going to go up and feed upward the building. At what floors are no longer any water pressure? This is a little bit less intuitive, but again, you have 2 minutes, so go. Okay, so this is a little bit less intuitive, but I'm going to make it so it is intuitive, right? So in this case, we have the water coming into a building at 75 psi. Which is more than the other one. Typically, it'll be around 50 psi. Sometimes it's a bit more. It can be as much as 75 sometimes. And so it's going to go up and up and up and up and up the building. And what's crazy is, at some height, if we had an open pipe going up the building, at some height, everything over that, there'd be no water in the pipe, which is kind of weird. So if you were to kind of, stick your head right here and look into the open pipe, if you had an open pipe that was a foot longer than this particular height, you were to look at it, water would not be pouring out of the open pipe, but you could stick your if it was big enough pipe, you could stick your hand in it, and a foot down, there'd be water. And the reason is because as it goes up and up and up, it loses pressure at the same rate that it does when it goes down, if you ignore friction. So what's happening is we're holding the water, in this case, in a water tower, and that water tower, as we talked about before, is 100. The last time, the answer to the last question was 115.5 feet, so it was something like 8 or 9 or 10 stories, and so it's going down, and it's seeking, water seeks its own level. So if that's an equal level, then water will seek its own level. If I had a clear tube and I filled it with water and I made a U out of it, the water would seek its own level. And so that may help you kind of understand the idea that if we're pumping water in from the bottom at a given pressure, eventually that pressure goes to zero. Does that mean you can put let me change the colors. Does that mean you can put a water fountain here? Probably not. The water would barely come out, because there's not enough pressure to make that arc. So different fixtures like showers or water fountains have minimum requirements for the water pressure. It's not that they won't work without it. Usually it'll just be one of those kind of drippy situations. We've all done that, right? There's something really, really that takes your humanity away when you're thirsty and you go to a water fountain and it just barely dribbles out, and you just kind of think, you got to be kidding me. It's kind of like when you go to a store and it says use other door. Like, if you have a door, just unlock it. It doesn't seem that hard. But anyhow, so the water is just going to dribble out up there, but down here, the water will flow out nicely. And actually down here, there may be leaks in the pipes. So the water pressure will as you move up, the water pressure goes down and down and down until eventually it gets to zero, because essentially the water has hit its own equilibrium. So in our case, we have 1 psi equals 2.31 feet of water. So if 1 psi equals 2.31 feet, then 75 psi, that's what we started with, is equal to 2.31 times 75, and that's going to be equal to 173.25. So if we divide that by 14, if you might have gotten a different number if you didn't use 14 feet per floor. I think some people like to use like 10 feet per floor, but that's not really how we're building these days in most buildings. But maybe you guys are a little bit more efficient or more comfortable with lower ceilings, and you're kind of tucking things in. But usually the structure and stuff is a bit more, so I said 14. But you could say 12, you could say 10. But at 14 feet, it's about 12 floors up. But the most important thing I wanted you to understand is that 12 floors up, it's, and we build buildings that are taller than 12 floors all the time. So what we typically do for those buildings is we either have some additional pumps every once in a while to add some pressure, or we have what's called a gravity down feed system, where we're storing water, on the 15th floor, and that's feeding, the 6 floors below it. Or we're storing water on the 30th floor, and that's feeding the 12 floors below it, or something like that, probably more realistically. All right, so water will seek its own level. All right, our final question is this, and this one I don't think you'll need 2 minutes for. But if I'm sitting, it's a cold day, it's a big window, assume this window is closed, it looks kind of open, but assume this window is closed. If I'm sitting right here by this window and the air temperature is, say, 75 degrees, how on earth can I be cold next to the window? You can put this one in the chat if you'd like. Why do I feel cold next to this window, this big window? Yeah, I mean, some of you guys got it. It's radiation. I mean, we have, 3 ways that heat moves between things in buildings. One is conduction, which is, it's cold outside, the molecules aren't dancing very fast, and so they kind of make the molecules in the window dance slower, and then the window is cold on the inside surface. That's conduction. And then there's convection, which happens in a couple of ways, but mainly because there are leaks in windows. But many people who will sit next to a window like this, I just can't get warm. This window is so drafty, and it may be that the window is drafty. But more likely, it's not that it's drafty. The more likely it's radiation. And so what radiation happens is, if you can see it, it can make you warm, or it can make you cold. Now, the warm, we can kind of intuit. This is a little bit similar to the plumbing thing, where one direction we kind of can picture it, and the other direction we somehow can't. I'm not sure if it has to do with our nerve endings or our skin, or the fact that, a cold surface that we typically see is only usually a few degrees colder than the room. But a hot surface like this that we sometimes see is just way hotter than the room. But we can imagine a scenario where it's a very cold night. The air temperature maybe is, the air temperature may be, 40 degrees. But if you're near enough to the fire, even though an air temperature would, be 40 degrees, or maybe near the fire through convection has heated the air around it to, say, 50 degrees, but you may be much, much warmer than that. You might feel like you're quite comfortable, because if you can see the fire, if you have something that's hot, let me make it red so it makes sense to be hot. If you have something that's hot, and you can see it, that heat will go through radiation, which is kind of magic. It doesn't even need air molecules to do it. It's not molecules bumping into each other like convection or conduction. It's totally different. It's kind of magic. And how much heat you gain from it is based on how big the fire is relative to you, and how hot the fire is relative to you. And it's a function of the cube, I think, of the fourth of the distance. So a little bit, you ever notice you feel like you got a tiny bit closer to the fire, you're going to melt, but you're fine right where you are, because distance has an outsized influence in this kind of situation. And we can intuit that, and we can intuit it somewhat from a radiator. Now, a radiator, of course, warms up the air. That's why you see this curve, to allow the lower air to get warmed and come out. So it warms up the air through convection. But there's also this kind of radiant quality where if you can see the radiator, you're getting some heat from it, which is why we put radiators underneath windows often. But if you're near a window, I think kind of intuitively you think, oh, it's not me losing radiant heat to the window or getting radiant cool from the window the way I would a fire. You just assume like the window must be leaky, and often the window is leaky, don't get me wrong. But there's a counterintuitive nature, which is that if you're near a big window, if you're very near a big window, you have a very cold surface relative to the room temperature, and it will be drawing heat away from your skin at a rate that is not typical for that room temperature. It's at a higher rate, and you'll feel uncomfortable. Now, I need to go back a little bit and correct the record, because you guys rightly said some things in the chat that I think it's probably worth mentioning. And I said it really doesn't matter if it's north or south, but of course it's given that it's a U-shaped building. So once they did correct it and say north is better, north is better. North is better for two reasons. One is north is better for two reasons. One is really one reason, I guess. The garden is more likely to be in the shade in the north side, because there's east, west, and south building blocking it. So you want to do things, and shade is very important in a hot, arid climate, and breezes are not anyway. So who cares which way the wind is coming from? Facing north is a good answer. So actually, I kind of take it back. Once you say it's a U-shaped configuration and you want people to be out in the courtyard, seems to me that north is actually a pretty good way to shape your building. So I take it back that it's, I had thought it was south facing because it had been. I said it was a stupid answer, stupid question. But once you say it's U-shaped, and then you decide that the wind direction is actually a distractor, that it's not relevant because we often design with more information than we need to make a decision. Then it kind of makes sense that they said, okay, north facing is a good answer. So I'll go ahead and stick with that as a good answer, and I'll take some of my criticism away from NCARB, just a little bit. I will open it up to questions. Go ahead and raise your hand and you'll be unmuted.
While we're waiting for folks to raise their hand, I did have a question in the chat come through on the second to last calculation.
Mm-hmm.
Someone just asked if you could go over that one again, because I think they're still just kind of wrestling with it.
Well, it's weird, right? So we have 75 PSI coming in, and in the same way that for every 2.31 feet you raise the water in the source, you get an extra PSI. In that exact same way, every time you increase the PSI by 1 on the building side, you are increasing the height the water can go by 2.31 feet. So if you have 75 PSI coming in, it can go up to, in our case, 173 feet. If you had 74 PSI, it would be like 171 feet. If you had 70 PSI and so forth, all the way down to 0 PSI would get you 0 feet up. So there needs to be a certain amount of pressure in the pipe for it to go up. And what I did is I took, if 1 PSI is 2.31 feet, I just multiplied both sides of that equation by 75 to get the 173.25 feet. All right, if we have no questions, good night, get licensed.